Good evening and good morning, folks. It's my pleasure and privilege from the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. I'm Jagdish Krishnaswamy. I'm the Dean of the School of Environment and Sustainability. And we are very happy to be part of this collaborative seminar series with the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. And this is the second in the series. A few weeks back, we had a very fantastic series of presentations and discussion by the faculty of the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. And today we are doing a reciprocal one from faculty at the School of Environmental Sustainability at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, Bengaluru. And Chandni Singh and Prathijna Poonacha and Amir Bazaz are my fellow faculty who will also be presenting along with myself. And over to Jose now.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I am Jose Lobo. I'm in the faculty of the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. Today I'm joined by two colleagues, Rimjing Agarwal and Jingo Wu. And we are very keen at the School of Sustainability. We're very keen on building a relationship, research, teaching, engagement with the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. So this series of research seminars are part of that discussion of how to do that. As Jagdish mentioned, this is the second such panel. There's a third one coming up in which graduate students from both of our institutions will present on our research. We're very fortunate that one graduate student here at Arizona State University, Garima Jain, has a long time history of engagement with the IIHS. So we have a bridge. So as I said, our ambitions are to build a relationship. It will take time, but this series is a very important part of getting to know each other and the overlaps among our research interests. So very happy that we can be here. I'm very much looking forward to learning from you all. So thank you and welcome. Let's start.
Thanks, Jose. I'm going to now share my screen. I hope that's visible, folks.
It is.
Okay. So I'm going to be talking about a recent initiative, conservation planning for biodiversity and ecosystem services. But before that, I will do a whirlwind sort of quick tour of how I've reached here in my research and journey. So my research career started in Costa Rica, actually, in the Cuenca de la Taraba, and that was in the mid-90s. And so my advisor was Daniel Richter, who was a soil scientist at the Nicholas School of Environment, as it was called at that point in time, at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. And so that was so most of my field work was very pleasant summers and some very stormy nights with the river and the sediment in the basin, in the Taraba Basin. And so I last saw Costa Rica in 97, I think. But then more than 20 years, almost 20 years later, I had the privilege of having a young faculty based in Costa Rica, Christian Burkel, who said that he had read my earlier papers from my PhD and said that he had additional data to cover, to sort of look at what happened to the Taraba Basin after I left my work. And so we put together his new data along with mine. And my data was spanning a few decades of deforestation that happened in the Taraba Basin and a period of a lot of loss of forest cover. And then his data was from the recovery period. So we were able to then stitch together another narrative so that got published a few years back. So even though I couldn't visit Costa Rica to do this work, I was very happy to collaborate with somebody based there. And then quite a bit of my work in the initial years was on eco-hydrology. And so I've been looking at the trade-off between infiltration and evapotranspiration, and how that can that trajectory can play out in different types of land cover change. And then when I went to India, I started working with instrumented catchments in different parts of the Western Ghats, both in the dry forests and the wet forests. So that has been quite a bit of, again, looking at the effect of land use and land cover change on hydrologic services. And again, and this is like these instrumented, long-term instrumented sites still exist and have some of the highest densities of rain gauges and water level recorders for certainly for India, but also possibly for these types of tropical montane forests and grasslands. And we have had a series of collaboration with the hydrologists in the UK and in the Netherlands. So this was another project that supported that, basically looking at, again, these setting up these instrumented sites and looking at response of forests and agroecosystems to extreme rainfall events. So that was my, in some sense, the beginning of my journey to getting into climate change. And then we also then looked at the effects of invasive species on the hydrology of these catchments. So that is something that was also interesting, because we actually found that the invasion of natural grasslands by exotic trees actually increases flood risks in these places, which is something that was not for which there was, in some sense, it was a novel finding. So which we recently published. Then I moved into another trajectory. I started collaborating with ecologists, because I found that I had a lot to learn from ecologists, aquatic ecologists, and they wanted to learn hydrology. So we traded knowledge. And so I had a long series of collaboration where I worked with aquatic ecologists, and then I got into river ecology in a very big way. So that was the next thing that I was able to do. And then I extended my work to looking at social ecological systems along river systems, looking at trade-offs and so on. So that's been a more recent work. It's becoming a little bit more interdisciplinary over time. And in between, I started getting interested in the effects of climate change on India's ecosystems. So that led me to work at slightly larger scales, covering for example, the monsoon systems, or covering mountain systems across the world, including the Himalayas. So that was the beginning of my interest in climate change as an area of work and practice. And then that led me to my work with the IPCC on the climate change and land degradation report. So I had the privilege and pleasure to be a coordinating lead author of the synthesis chapter of that report. And then more recently at IIHS, I have again gotten into the climate change work through these IPCC derivative reports, which is basically these 3 reports, which is on the physical science, climate mitigation and impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, are all basically synthesizing of the urban related messages from all the reports in the AR6 cycle. And then finally, I have now also been working on restoration. So we have just released a report for policymakers with key messages on how do we approach restoration, ecological restoration in India. So this is basically my journey. And so now I will get to other things related to the topic that I will be sharing with you. So in the past, conservation planning in India has always been just about biodiversity, and the focus as you can see on the left-hand side, it's on the Western Ghats biodiversity hotspot. And that was in 2006. I was also part of that work. So we took this. India has now about 3 global biodiversity hotspots. So this is one of them, the Western Ghats. So again, we looked just at biodiversity and we were able to do this prioritization. However, we have realized that prioritizing landscapes for just biodiversity has severe limitations because ecosystem services and human well-being need to be looked at as well. And so when you do a combined prioritization of India's ecosystems for both biodiversity and ecosystem services, then perhaps the political will as well as the citizens' support for conservation would become much stronger. So that was how we got into this. It was the first time that ecosystem services was being combined with biodiversity for an all India exercise of this kind. So India is, of course, hyper diverse in terms of its habitats, biodiversity, as well as the socio-cultural diversity. We have 1.4 billion people, so we need to conserve our biodiversity and also ensure human well-being. And here we can see that a lot of this biodiversity exists in close proximity to humans. Even in some of the so-called wilder areas, cities, towns, and villages are not very far away. There's quite a long history of human use of many of these habitats. So on the top right, you can see a Gangetic river dolphin right next to a fishing boat in the Kosi Ganga area, so in the river, in the Ganga basin. So that's an endangered dolphin, which actually does quite well in coexistence with the traditional fisheries and so on. But there are, of course, emerging threats for that. But there are habitats throughout the country where we need to share space between humans and nature and biodiversity. So that was in some sense the motivation for us. So we wanted to identify these priority landscapes. And how did we go about doing that? We first looked at the biogeographic zones of India. And so we chose 8 of these. They represent the country's geographies, ecoregions, social and cultural diversity, as well as the human pressures. And so our goal was to identify priority landscapes within and across these zones. So we also wanted to ensure that we don't end up comparing apples and oranges. So we did we looked at prioritization within each biogeographic zone as well. So I'm not going to go into the methods. It involved expert consultations, identifying the themes, the spatial units, as well as putting together a bunch of remotely sensed and GIS layers which are available for both biodiversity and ecosystem services. So in the past, habitat conservation in India has often been biased towards forested areas. In this exercise, we selected 28 habitat types that included forests along with several often ignored habitats like grasslands, scrub, ravines, riverine vegetation, and swamps. So this way, we were able to not just focus on the most dominant habitats in each zone, but also areas which are unique, rare, or threatened, and also areas which are dwindling in terms of habitat. And the ecosystem services that we were able to put together, we looked at water services and carbon. And in terms of the water services, we considered both blue water flux as well as green water flux, because both are in different situations are very important ecosystem services. So that was what we were able to combine along with biodiversity. As far as biodiversity is concerned, we considered threatened species of mammals, birds, amphibians, and reptiles, and also the areas where these species may be found in relative numbers. We used an index for each zone that captured the diversity of the threatened species. We also included India's protected areas, which includes national parks and wildlife sanctuaries, and the locations identified globally as key biodiversity areas. usually often for birds. In terms of the threats, we considered a bunch of factors, including the usual suspects like human population, livestock, agricultural intensification, river fragmentation for riverine areas. But we also looked at linear infrastructure, the extent of urbanization, and also vegetation greening and vegetation browning, because greening and browning are in response to both climate variability and climate change, but also land use and land cover change. And not all greening is good, because some of the greening is because of proliferation of invasive species. And not all browning is bad, because it could also simply be because of reduction in density of trees and so on. So we recognize that. We also looked at future climate as well as rainfall anomalies. So it was fairly comprehensive in terms of looking at these threats. Then we were able to prioritize based on individual themes, habitats, ecosystem services, and biodiversity. And basically, the threats analysis showed the effects of agricultural expansion and urbanization, intensification, linear infrastructure, roads and railways, and also urban centers and agriculture belts were major threat hotspots. And when we looked at all of this, and we prioritized the top 30% of India in terms of importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services, we found that only 15% of these top 30% are located within the existing protected area network. So if we have to achieve the 30% coverage of the country that India and many other countries have promised at the recent COP late last year, as well as the 220 CBD Global Biodiversity Framework, then we really need to consider finding ways of sharing space with biodiversity and ecosystem services, which means that it cannot be just land sparing, because the space and opportunity to have more protected areas is diminishing. And so we will have to conserve the bulk of our priority sites by finding ways of coexisting with sustainable development pathways that need to be fashioned in the coming years. And we also then looked at how many of these high biodiversity and ecosystem service priority sites, how do they match in terms of the aspirational districts, which are basically the districts in India, which the central planning body of India called the Niti Aayog, which has basically divided India into different types of categories based on human development indices and the status of development. So these aspirational districts are areas where human development indices are quite low in comparison to other areas. And so we looked at that so that we could think of ways and means of informing the development pathways in these districts which overlap with the high priority areas that we have identified. And then we want to now share this with different states and with the central planning body and the concerned ministries in the government of India to take forward take this conservation planning exercise and see how it can inform the future sharing of space between humans and nature in India. So this was our collaborative work. There were 18 authors from 15 institutions, and this was sponsored by the National Mission on Biodiversity and Human Wellbeing, which was run by the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India. And so in that sense, it was a very good collaborative effort across a bunch of institutions, and also sponsored by the Government of India. We are hopeful that we will be able to take this forward in terms of informing planning. In terms of looking at emerging land use and land cover change, urban infrastructure and urban centers are growing all across the country. In a few decades, 50% of Indians will be living in urban or urbanizing areas. So we really need to find ways of incorporating conservation planning even within these urban areas. So an earlier piece of work we did showed that if you have an infrastructure, linear infrastructure density of just 400 meters in a square kilometer, then you can have a lot of disruption of ecological connectivity. And then the movement can be reduced considerably if you have 200 meters per square kilometer. So we need to keep this in mind, that urban infrastructure and linear infrastructure, which are growing across the country, we have to find ways of mitigating them, mitigating the impacts of these linear infrastructure by having overpasses or underpasses, avoidance in certain key important areas, and also other ways of ensuring ecological connectivity is that it's not disrupted by urbanization or by linear infrastructure. So this is going to be a very challenging area of work, to look at infrastructure corridors and how they are likely to impact conservation in the future. So here is just an example. This is the IIHS, emerging IIHS campus here. And then we have an urban forest next to it. So these are all different patches of urban forests. And then there is this protected area called Bannerghatta National Park here. And in between is an area which is actively urbanizing. So if we have to find opportunities for conservation, we have to consider every type of land use and participation of citizens. We have to look at gardens, we have to look at parks, we have to look at perhaps even plants, potted plants on rooftops, every opportunity to have ecological connectivity and foster refugia for urban biodiversity, for butterflies, birds, and so on. Obviously, we can't do that for some of the very large animals like tigers or elephants, but we can certainly do that for a lot of other biodiversity that I think can offer opportunities for coexistence if the urbanization is fashioned sustainably. So these are just, we are just beginning to map the distribution of urban biodiversity across the city. This for 2 species of birds, both are frugivores, just to look at where they are found in the city and what are the drivers of their distribution, so that we can have a conservation plan that's exclusively for Bengaluru and Bengaluru's peri-urban area. So in the urban area, we need to have biodiversity not just in parks and reserves, because biodiversity does also live in the built environment. So we need to find ways of tolerating and supporting conservation of biodiversity, even in spaces where built surfaces are there. So these are just 2, the greater short-nosed fruit bat on the left and the grey hornbill. They are found in parts of Bengaluru in close proximity to human infrastructure and buildings. And we need to actually have a conservation plan even for the built areas, because there are species which use them. So here again, these are all examples, the shikra on the left and the kestrel on the right. They're all using human infrastructure. They have some level of adaptation to humans in the city. But for nature to thrive and to have a conservation plan in an urban area, I think we need to give a little bit of help to biodiversity. So on the left, you have a bee hotel for solitary bees, which in partnership with another organization, A-Tree, which has actually set up 50 bee hotels all across the city. So we have got 2 of them on our campus. In the middle, we have a box for insectivorous bats, a roosting box. And then on the top right, you can see we have had a nesting box for owls on our campus, and it was quickly colonized by owls. So we have to find some very innovative ways for planning for conservation in urban and urbanizing areas, along with whatever opportunities exist for conserving biodiversity in protected areas and in areas such as wetlands and other ecosystems where coexistence and sharing of space is the only way forward. Because as I said, only 15% of the high priority areas across India are found in our existing protected area network. And so the remaining 85% can only persist and be conserved if we are able to get our sustainable development pathways in the right manner. So I'm going to end here, and thank you for listening to this.
Thank you, Jagdish. That was very comprehensive and very informative. Thank you.
Over to Chandni.
Thanks, Jagdish. All right, I'll
may,
just share.
May I ask a question, or we're going to wait until the end?
Now go ahead, Jingo. Ask now while the question is fresh. If
Okay.
Chandni does not mind.
Jagdish, yeah, I was very interested in and impressed by Jagdish's talk. It's all about hydrology and landscape ecology and landscape sustainability, urban ecology, all the areas I have been working on. I'm very impressed. And I actually almost became an eco-hydrologist when I was a graduate student. So we have a lot in common there. I really like the idea that conservation is not just for conservation. The land sharing, land sparing debate is really not a debate. To me, I think we need both. It's a matter of scale. It's a matter of context. I think, and also it's very important that I think our goal is ultimate goal is sustainability at landscape scale and global scale. It's not just to protect biodiversity for what? So I think our common journey is for sustainability, and our approach, I think, finally, I think ecologists began to understand, and other scientists also began to understand. We should have the same approach, that is to unite or integrate biodiversity, ecosystem function, structure, services, and well-being. Then I think the greatest challenge is to close the loop. That is to go from human well-being back to landscape pattern, then biodiversity, ecosystem function, services, human well-being. Because this loop can only be closed through landscape planning, landscape design, which is based on hydrology, ecology, climatology, all the natural social sciences and humanities. So I was really impressed. I hope I'll read more of your papers. But do you have? I just wonder if you have your team and other Indian colleagues have done any research in terms of landscape sustainability. What you are talking about, I clearly is landscape sustainability, right? And integrating all the different sciences. But it is a landscape sustainability research in India something that is recognized, being promoted?
I think it sort of exists in different ways. It may be called something else. It's there.
Okay.
We used to have an integrated watershed development program, but that focused mainly on certain aspects of hydrologic functions. We have had folks who are working only on biodiversity. Then ecosystem services came in. What I still think is that we don't have a sufficient number of interdisciplinary work on sustainability or sustainable landscapes. We need both biophysical and social science dimensions to be addressed together. And I think that, and also things like adaptation, climate change adaptation, and so on, because this is what is going to happen in the near future. So we have to link all of that. And I think that we've still not managed to get it all together. There are some encouraging developments, but I think that the science is ahead of the practice. So the practice has to, I think, be informed by the evidence and the science, and also a lot more social science and biophysical folks need to work together. I hope that can happen, and we would have, I think, even better I think success in terms of designing these sustainable landscapes for the future. Thank you for your
Yeah, you're welcome to write something for our journal, Landscape Ecology. It's really important stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jagdish.
Thank you.
So,
Thank
yeah,
you.
over
Thank you
to
very much.
Chandni. Yeah.
I'm just checking, did Garima have a question as well or no? Oh, okay, I just thought. All right, I'll now share my screen. Yeah, wonderful to have this opportunity. When I was applying for PhDs, I remember ASU was one of my top choices, but I then never managed to apply finally. So it's really nice to be able to do this. I will be speaking about mobility, migration, planned relocation, and whether it is a climate change adaptation strategy or not. But before going into the topic, I'll just give a brief overview of where I've come from and perhaps what I'm doing. I was trained as a botanist, did my undergraduate degree in botany, but then moved to natural resource management. Actually, then worked for some years in the high altitude Himalayas all across all the Himalayan states in India, really trying to think about community-based natural resource management. And after a few years of all of that practice-based work, I was ready to do a PhD and went on to work on or research climate change adaptation in drought-prone areas in India. And I was based at the University of Reading in the School of Agriculture Policy and Development. So that's my academic journey. Currently, of course, I work at the intersection of climate change adaptation and development, and really focus on the idea that given development deficits currently, an agrarian crisis all across India, but also across much of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, there are livelihoods that are changing and there are people's aspirations that are changing. And often these aspirations are non-agrarian and non-rural in nature. And resource use too is changing in both rural and urban areas. So my work really focuses on trying to understand how climate change impacts this uneven development and this really space of changing livelihoods and changing aspirations. Within that, over the past decade at least, I've been focusing a lot on what are the different drivers of vulnerability to climate change, why and how do people adapt to climate change and climate variability, and often why do certain people not choose to adapt. I'm very interested in understanding behavioral and other aspects of why people choose not to adapt to these, knowing that they are increasingly, already experiencing climate impacts, but also understand that climate risks are increasing. And then the last part of the story, of course, is trying to understand when people or governments or communities are really making these decisions, what are the outcomes on societal well-being, people's aspirations, but also a bit on sustainability of social ecological systems. And I've been working mainly across South Asia, but have done over the past 8-9 years some work in sub-Saharan African countries as well. And then this is just a bit of really service that I've been doing. I was a lead author for the Asia chapter in the recent IPCC Working Group 2 report. I was also part of the special report on 1.5 degrees, which was a particularly challenging but also exciting initiative, and then a range of other international initiatives on really knowledge synthesis for informing policy. All right, so now I'll really move into what I want to speak about today. Just a second, I want to try and, yeah, all right. So for context, of course, we know that, and this really came out of the work that I was doing as part of the IPCC's Asia chapter, where we were just looking at these terrible numbers of climate impacts and losses and damages that Asia, the region, we were assessing literature from 52 countries, looking at how climate-induced extreme events are really playing havoc with lives, but also infrastructure and livelihoods and so on in the region. And one of the things that repeatedly comes up, the story of how extreme events are driving disaster-induced displacement. While there's a big, the news headlines often talk about international movement and climate refugees, there's a wider, deeper story of internal displacement within Asian countries. So that's really for context, and these are some numbers from the IDMC grid report that comes out every year. And you see the big blue bubbles are basically displacement by disasters, and the orange ones are by conflict. And you see, of course, this concentration of the big bubbles denoting just large numbers of people being internally displaced across South and Southeast Asia. Also, on the other side, as part of the IPCC report, what we assessed was these observed impacts of climate change on human systems. And here again, displacement comes up as something that we have very high confidence attributing to climate change and climate impacts, and seeing that there is increasing adverse impacts of climate change on displacement in Asia. So recognizing all of this, of course, the big finding from the IPCC report that we sort of fine-tuned was that, of course, the evidence is unequivocal that climate change is a threat to both human well-being and the health of the planet. And while there has been a lot of adaptation action, this progress is uneven. It's very sectoral in nature and also specific to certain risks. So you've got flood resilience plans, you've got heat action plans, but you don't have projects, interventions, and actually planning mechanisms for more complex risk that is really holistic in nature. And the other big finding that we really stressed was that there are increasing gaps between what current adaptation we are seeing on the ground and what's needed. And that's commonly called the adaptation gap. So really this difference between what's intended, what's needed, and what's implemented is growing. And we also showed that actually it's higher for people in low-income groups. In the IPCC, this was part of the framework that I helped co-develop, which was trying to understand the feasibility of adaptation options across the globe. And here again, I want to highlight the options around mobility and planned relocation. First of all, I mean, this is a multi-dimensional feasibility assessment where we broke up feasibility or the potential of an action or the possibility of an adaptation action actually occurring into 6 dimensions. And then we assess the literature to see that how much of this dimension is a barrier to adaptation or not. And here, of course, we had these very small bubbles around planned relocation and human migration. First, of course, some of them are low barriers, they're less barriers, but also we had very little evidence and weren't able to sort of assess this to the degrees that we wanted to. So I think this is why also I think this is a particularly interesting area to look at, because while there's a lot of smoke around or conversation around human mobility, resettlement, and migration, there's not enough evidence on how feasible this is, and then of course how effective it is to deal with climate risks. So this brings me to to my own work. I mean, that was just a bit of context that we did in the IPCC, but really 2 things I'm going to be talking about here. First of all, rural to urban internal migration or domestic migration happening within country borders from drought-prone rural regions to large metropolitan cities in India. And the second one is a project that we did incidentally with Garima as well on state-led planned relocation to reduce cyclone and flooding exposure in coastal communities. So to start with the story of rural to urban migration, this was based in South India, and we were really trying to, through in-depth life history interviews and other forms of qualitative data collection, trying to understand what happens when people move from rural areas to urban areas and how our lives and livelihoods really affected, and where does vulnerability really fall as people move. So in the literature, of course, there's been a lot of conversation about, is migration adaptation? Is it a failure to adapt? There are lots of people who've said that those who aren't able to adapt in place are actually the ones who are moving, and therefore it's a failure to adapt. While others have argued that actually migrants are early adapters. There's this idea of the entrepreneurial migrant who actually sends remittances back home and is able to sort of help risk management in rural areas. Many people have called migration serendipitous adaptation, where just somehow economic migrants actually end up adapting. But what we found in our work is that the reality, of course, is much more mixed. Migrant outcomes differ based on who you are, what types of jobs you're moving into, the conditions you move under, the gender and the caste you belong to, and of course, the metrics you actually use to assess outcomes of migration. So this is where we did our work. We were, of course, we are based in Bangalore here in the south of the state of Karnataka. And then we were looking at rural areas, 2 districts, Kolar and Gulbarga, which are drought-prone, water-scarce districts in the state. The state is a semi-arid state and is prone to dry spells within the rainy season, but also throughout the year. And multi-year droughts are quite common, especially in North Karnataka in this region. On the one hand, you've got this story of climate variability, but you've also got a story of deep socioeconomic change, where lots of farmers we spoke to and children of farmers actually want to move out of farming. And that whole story of aspirational change and wanting to move to the city as a way to develop or to have better well-being outcomes really is the story that repeatedly came across the 5 years that we were doing this work. And we particularly chose these 2 sites because on the one hand, Kolar being close to this mega city of Bangalore, actually people commute daily over the 100 kilometers by train, while Gulbarga, you see more semi-permanent migration, seasonal migration, where people move with their entire families sometimes for many months at a time. So now coming to what we really found, of course, this whole story of moving from drought-prone, water-scarce regions has been spoken about, and it's nothing new. I'd like to highlight that lots of people have always been using movement and mobility as a way to manage their risk and a way to sometimes diversify livelihoods in times of shocks and stresses. But what's changing is that in many places, and with climate change as an additional stressor, rural livelihoods are no longer considered or perceived viable livelihoods, and many people, as job opportunities are opening up, there are better transport corridors between places, people are tending to move out in larger numbers. Of course, those with more resources and social networks move out first, and then families and people from marginalized castes and poorer households move next. So the story of people moving out is really one of a deep dejection from agrarian livelihoods, living in drought-prone drylands, and really not seeing a future in climate-sensitive livelihoods like farming and pastoralism. But on the other side, this is what people are moving into. In cities like Bangalore, where, I mean, these are pictures from some of our own fieldwork, where people often move into these very precarious living conditions, and then they move into new risks. So this shifting from one type of risk, which was drought-prone rural areas, to another type of risk and landscape, really, which is flood-prone mega cities in India, is really a story of shifting vulnerability, of entering sites where risks are completely new, social networks are severed, and often gendered burdens of work and care really get exacerbated. People also enter very precarious livelihoods. People are often living with very poor service provision. And so there's this entire story of exacerbating vulnerability and heightened differential vulnerability. I won't go into this in too much detail because I want to get to the remainder of my slides, and I'm not sure how much time I have left. But just to say that we did these very in-depth life history interviews over 3 years with around 25 households, trying to unpack how men and women are differentially vulnerable, but then also how migration impacts male and female well-being very differently within the household. So women reported having less time for leisure, issues of safety once they move into urban areas. And what we really finally ended up saying is that while we talk about remittances and money that people send back as a way, as a proxy to measure the positive impacts or any impacts of moving, they are a really blunt way of measuring the actual outcomes of moving. And perhaps we need more holistic ways of trying to understand the trade-offs that households, these translocal, multi-local households are actually playing with when they migrate. And often remittances, we found, are being used to fund further well digging in the village, which over time we found are maladaptive strategies. So you've got an already water scarce region completely emptying out its groundwater over time, fueled by these remittances that are coming by migrants. So that's just one example of how these risk management strategies of moving also that stretch households across rural and urban areas then have these impacts that stretch again across rural and urban areas. So the second bit of work I wanted to talk about really was the story of another kind of movement, which is not as autonomous as the earlier movement I spoke about. And it's really the story of planned relocation, where the state has been entering into the space of trying to manage risk on behalf of households. In this case, we were doing work in another South Indian state called Tamil Nadu, where we were looking at the capital city of Chennai and a rural district of Nagapattinam. Both these areas have seen repeated extreme events in the form of cyclones, but also, of course, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and then a series of cyclones and floods thereafter. So when it comes to the story of Chennai, of course, I'm going to focus on the city. It's a large, very old city with a lot of informal settlements across its many water bodies and riverbanks. And after the 2015 floods, but also repeated cyclones, there has been the sort of response from the state has been to relocate people, to reduce risk. So once you move people out of these riverbeds, around these riverbeds, you will reduce exposure and therefore reduce risk. However, what happened is these people were moved out of these places of so-called risk, but moved into housing like this, high-rise resettlement colonies, which unfortunately were built on many of Chennai's wetlands and themselves prone to flooding. And so as people moved, of course, there was a loss of livelihoods. These colonies reported high violence, a complete erosion of social capital, and then, of course, a complete loss of a way of life. People talked about yearning for the sea. These are fishing communities that have often lived very close to the coast and now have been moved almost 50 to 70 kilometers away from where they used to live. And so there's this complete loss of identity and a way of life for many people. And we were really wanting to understand that this so-called well-meaning state, why is the government still investing in these kind of actions, knowing that they are detrimental in so many ways? And that's when we started unpacking through this project that was called Recovery with Dignity, a 3-year-long project, where we started unpacking what does recovery and risk reduction really mean for the government, for humanitarian agencies, and for people themselves. And what we found is that top-down narratives of risk reduction tend to be in the shape of relocation. They tend to talk about big infrastructure, ideas of build back better, and they tend to be finite. So you want to relocate people and then have an end to that, have tangible assets like houses built, and sort of say that we have recovered, we have reduced risk. However, these are the pictures that people that we spoke to actually painted and drew in group discussions that we had with male and female respondents. Risk reduction at the front lines of climate change, at the front lines of disasters, are really beyond building back better. They are talking about the ability to fish, about having social spaces like temples being fixed after a cyclone. They're talking about trees. So for people on the ground and the front line, actually risk reduction and recovery is really about thinking beyond building back better in the very literal sense of the word. It's about staying in place and staying where they have been and for many generations. And it is an ongoing process. A lot of people talked about recovery being able to see their children go back to school, being able to see trees grow back and actually sit under the shade of those trees. So what I want to highlight here is that these ideas or these representations of different forms of recovery really clash with each other. And that's why we end up with the outcomes that we do. This work also led to a very interesting graphic novel that we presented, where we brought some of these narratives from the ground, really, to talk about some of these stories that don't lend themselves easily to journal articles and to academic presentations, but make for very powerful stories and narratives of change. All right, and then I'm just going to end in 3 minutes maybe. This is some very recent work that has just come out that I was part of. It came out from the IPCC report, but I think it's really something I'd like to highlight, especially given that ASU also does a lot of cutting edge work on adaptation. One of the big things that a lot of people have been talking about is that while there's a lot of adaptation action going on, some of it is having unintended consequences. So we know that from various UNEP reports that the number of adaptation projects is increasing. And these projects are growing larger and larger. And although, of course, today the recent UNEP adaptation gap report has come out and it said that it's nowhere near what we need, the kind of funding that's going into adaptation. But of course, we know the total number of projects are increasing. And you would imagine, I mean, this is another burning embers diagram from the IPCC, which says that as you adapt, your risk goes down. So that's the ideal adaptation, right? If you do adaptation well, risks should reduce. But is that really happening? And that's where the idea of maladaptation comes into place, where we say that some adaptation can have unintended negative consequences. And these negative consequences can be in a variety of ways. And actually in this paper, we had argued that some maldevelopment can also lead to maladaptation. So it's not only climate interventions, but a range of other interventions can sort of reduce the space for adaptation and can also be termed as maladaptation. So to sort of diagnose this risk or potential of maladaptation, we've come up with this framework which sort of tries to pull together some of the ideas that also Jagdish mentioned, which is that we need to bridge metrics that we use from ecosystem services and ecological sciences, but also some of the metrics around equity and justice, which are these three at the bottom, and really try and think about how do we assess maladaptation at a system scale. So we came up with these 6 criteria and sort of then it's a continuum of sorts, and we rate different adaptation actions on these, whether it, for example, whether a certain action increases impacts on ecosystems and ecosystem services or reduces impacts on these. And so it's like a slider that we developed with these 6 indicators. And then at a global scale, we rated various adaptation measures. And yeah, I won't go through this, but just to say that this particular framework, I feel, is important at this stage also because we are in the process of negotiating a global goal on adaptation. And how do we really think about avoiding maladaptation and avoiding bad investments that just increase vulnerability over and over again. All right, I'll stop there, and I hope I didn't go over too much. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Chandni. Maybe I can make a comment or question, because this is very interesting presentation, and I think the topic of relocation as an adaptation solution is a very important conversation to be had. But as well, I know you know, Chandni, but I think everybody in this call knows, for informal settlement communities throughout the global south, the concept of the phenomenon of relocation is a very is a concept and an action that has a long history and a very negative one. So I think there is the dialogue that needs to be had with communities who live in informal settlements, what are typically called slums, about relocation as an adaptation measure. A conversation which is started to happen among policymakers. It's crucial that it be held in a way that involves them, because it's that for most slum communities, relocation has never been a positive action. So I think this work that you and others have started to do in India is very relevant to these other conversations. For example, a similar conversation has started in South Africa and in Senegal, and it has started also in Brazil. But again, it is still mainly at the level of decision makers, maybe with some academics thrown in, but not yet really involving the communities that are going to be told you need to move. So I just applaud this work very much, and I hope it's an area that we can collaborate. But I wanted to ask you, Chandni, about ongoing dialogues that are going on, maybe between you and other colleagues at the IIHS and organizations in India that represent slum dwellers. And of course, India is the birthplace of slum dwellers organizations. Is that something that's going on now or can happen in the future? If there are dialogues going on now, can they be broadened to maybe include slum dwellers organizations in other parts of the global south? But
yeah, thank you so much for that, Jose. And I think we do, of course, for a lot of our work, we actually partner with activists in informal settlements, activist groups, but also civil society actors. So we have a very strong network across India. Of course, some geographies more than others, but we do have a strong network. And I think there's a lot of skills that we as researchers actually pick up from them on influencing policy. We, of course, can't move completely towards the side of activism, but I think we learn a lot from them. And that's, at least from the Recovery with Dignity project, we used art as a potential way to talk about some of these more difficult stories, which and that graphic novel, or that little book, has actually traveled to quite a lot of places, and it's been translated into 4 languages as well. So it's yeah, I think it's oh yeah, Garima has a copy of it. It's called Afterwards, and it's available online, open access. It's a beautiful little book. So yeah, I think, yeah, but coming back to your question, yes, we do work with a lot of activist groups in different degrees. Of course, it's also the timelines that we work in are often very different. And so it's really that transdisciplinary space we start entering, and it's not easy because we too have to be humble about what we can offer. And they, of course, speak in a very different language and work at very different time scales. So there's all of that, but yeah.
thank you, Chandni.
There is a question for you.
Aurora, yes.
Yes,
Aurora,
thank
go
you.
ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask briefly, so this was a fantastic and very helpful presentation. Thank you very much. And I'm a first-year PhD student at the School of Sustainability at ASU, and am very interested in this topic, but feel that I have a lot of learning to do. I'm a white American student here in Arizona, for one thing. And I wondered if you have any recommendations for students such as myself, either of first papers to read or most important concepts to Google, or even, as you mentioned, with working with activists, if there are other resources you know of, whether it's on social media or websites, or just ways to get more exposed to the conversation that is happening around informality and relocation as adaptation. I would love to find some of those resources, and I'd be happy to email you about this if that's easier at the end. But if you have any suggestions, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, thanks, Aurora. And I'm very happy to send you some resources for sure. I think there's a lot. It sometimes can feel a bit overwhelming, but a good literature review and some amount of decent Google search abilities really help. But I'll send you some resources in any case, if you just send me an email.
Sure, that sounds great. Thank you so much.
And just, yes, thanks so much, Chandni and Jagdish. Just a quick response to Aurora. As you might know, we have a student panel coming up on November 16th, a little advertisement for that. So this could be something that the students could jointly sort of see where there are interesting areas of intersection, and maybe you could form joint student groups that exchange these readings and resources across Indian and our students here at ASU. So something to look forward to.
That's a great idea. Yes, I'll definitely be planning to attend that panel.
And I just wanted to say, Rimjim, I saw your comment just now. I've read so much of your work, so it's I know that there are overlaps. So it's really nice to, yeah, nice to be presenting to this audience.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. To Prathijna.
Hello. Hi, so let me first start by sharing my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, very clearly.
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's a Really nice to be presenting to this audience, and thank you for the opportunity. My name is Prathijna, and I'm a faculty at the School of Environment and Sustainability at IIHS. A little bit about my background. I'm trained as an architect, and I started out as a practicing architect doing interior design and architectural projects, but then moved on to a slightly larger scale at the city level, worked on conservation, heritage conservation at a city level, and then slowly meandered into sort of climate change adaptation and working at at larger scale. So currently my work focuses on climate change adaptation in urban and peri-urban areas. And I'm slowly sort of moving towards building a body of work around the built environment and climate change adaptation. How do you really think about adapting using built environment as an entry point? So today I'm going to talk a little bit about urban agriculture, urban and peri-urban agriculture. And I'm going to be reflecting from a few projects that we've done at IIHS that sort of looks at this topic from different entry points. So the context for this, to set the context, we all know that the global south is urbanizing at a very rapid rate, especially in India. We know that in a couple of decades, more than 50% of the country is going to be living in urban areas. And again, much of this global urbanization is also happening in countries of the global south, in mostly Asia and Africa. Now, there is a twofold reality to this urbanization. On the one hand, there are a lot of problems that's associated to urbanization, issues like congestion, shrinking green spaces, increased greenhouse gas emissions. But on the other hand, it also provides an opportunity to improve well-being and develop sustainable solutions at scale, and to sort of make a difference to a much larger population. And in addition to this, there's also the context of peri-urban areas, which is transforming rapidly in a very particular kind of way. So in peri-urban areas, we're seeing the transformation of mostly agrarian land uses to non-agrarian urban land uses, and mostly moving away from agriculture into other kinds of land uses. And some of the reasons associated with this is, of course, better employment opportunities, better living standards in the city, but also in general, decreasing quality of the environment in peri-urban areas, decreasing market prices for agricultural produce, difficulty of finding labor, and generally better employment opportunities in the city. And this is a particular entry point we look at in one of the projects that we did at IIHS, which is called Adaptation at Scale in Semi-Arid Regions, which actually sort of, we looked at several kinds of transformations happening in multiple landscapes. And one of the works that Chandni presented in rural Karnataka was also a part of this project. But the peri-urban work stream in this project looked really at the transitions occurring in peri-urban Bangalore to understand if climate change had any role to sort of drive this kind of peri-urbanization in addition to what was already happening. Excuse me. So what we saw in that study is that definitely, like I mentioned, things like quality of reducing quantity of water and the quality of water, decreasing rainfall, and sort of more difficulty in growing the kind of crops that people were used to growing, had led to sort of moving away from agricultural livelihoods and taking up other forms of livelihoods, which was more accessible because of the closeness to the city. So starting from this kind of a entry point, in the next project, which is called UpAgri, Urban and Peri-Urban Agriculture as Green Infrastructure, we actually then started to look at what is the state of urban and peri-urban agriculture in rapidly urbanizing cities and megacities. And really, does urban and peri-urban agriculture, how does it contribute to sustainability and well-being outcomes? So much of the remaining slides, I'm going to actually talk from the work we did on this project. Yeah. So the question we were asking is, does urban agriculture contribute to urban sustainability and well-being outcomes? And to start with, of course, we realized that this is urban and peri-urban agriculture, UPA for short, happens at multiple scales, at individual scales, in households, in neighborhood scales, in communities, at a city scale, but as well as in regional scales, where in peri-urban areas, still some large farmlands did exist, and there were farmers still practicing large-scale agriculture. So from we started with the hypothesis that there were several sustainability and well-being outcomes to UPA, and the sustainability outcomes, at least the ones that we were wanting to investigate further, was around water resource management, land use and space planning, solid waste management. Did it have any sort of outcomes for climate change mitigation? What kind of outcomes did it have for biodiversity? And the well-being outcomes, we sort of focused on subjective well-being outcomes from urban and peri-urban agriculture. So what are the implications for health, quality of life, mental well-being? What are the material well-being implications? So what are the economic aspects, in terms of livelihood, income generation? What were the relational well-being aspects, including community cohesion, community bonding, cohesion, and environmental awareness? Now, all of these things sort of we arrived at these kind of entry points after a literature review, a global literature review that we carried out, which sort of pointed us to these kind of outcomes from urban and peri-urban agriculture. Okay, so quickly moving on to methods, we employed multiple methods to do this project. So starting from a primary review of literature that existed both in India as well as globally. We moved on to review of urban plans and policies at a national scale, then went on to sort of, so actually when we started this project, the idea was that we were going to be on the field, doing a lot of field work, talking to a lot of practitioners. And we started this project in late 2019, and that's when, and just when we were off to start the project, the pandemic hit, and we had to really sort of shift our plans from doing a lot of field-based work to shifting it online. So we did a lot of key informant interviews online, and when the pandemic sort of was under control and we could travel again, we did several scoping visits, and then moved on to structured surveys, and both online and in person. And then we sort of zeroed into some case studies which we wanted to dig deeper, and then sort of, that's how we went about it. So ultimately, we did focus on 2 cities. We focused on Bangalore and Pune in India, but this project was across India and Tanzania, and there were 2 other cities in Tanzania, Morogoro and I can't recollect the other, Dar es Salaam. Those were the 2 cities in Tanzania, but in India that we focused on Pune and Bangalore. We did about 29 multi-scale practitioner case studies. We put together a compendium, worked with about 29-30 practitioners to build out the cases from that. We had about 72 key informant in-depth interviews, about 500, close to a 500 survey respondents, deep dived into 4 thematic, and I'll speak a little bit more about it, thematic case studies, and multiple consultations. And these were some of the geospatial analysis we used to start our work with to understand sort of what is the changing landscape in which we were working. So if you see, this is Bangalore here, and you can see from 2001 to 2016, you can see the land use, land cover change. The red indicates urbanizing landscape. And similarly in Maharashtra, from 2001 to 2016, you see how rapidly built up areas are increasing and green cover is reducing. Okay, so to move into some of the results. So we found that, of course, urban agriculture is practiced at different scales. There are multi-scalar typologies, starting from individual farms and gardens, in rooftops, in backyard gardens, in balconies, at a very individual level, to sort of moving to and not only in middle class and upper middle class communities, but also in actually lower income settlements where intuitively we thought that it may not exist so rampantly because of the constraint on space, time, and money. But we did see a lot of examples where even in low income settlements there were examples of growing, in any open space, in pots and containers, and in much smaller spaces. And then the other typology was around community gardens. So where common spaces were sort of, which was either leased out or rented out, or people came together and gardened in lake beds. And so it was not an individual endeavor, but it was a sort of at a slightly larger scale, at a community level, whether it was organized or as a commercial venture. But there are several examples of community garden spaces, both in Bangalore and Pune. And then there is a very rich and vibrant landscape of urban farming as enterprise. So we see a lot of smaller enterprises coming up around urban farming, which either looks at setting up gardens in urban homes, or it sort of looks at growing exotic vegetables, fruits, and herbs and greens, and then caters to a very urban audience, urban consumer audience. Okay, so these are the 4 sort of case studies that we wanted to deep dive in after we understood what the landscape of urban agriculture looked like. So we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the subjective well-being aspect of urban agriculture, where the question we were asking is, what are the outcomes of urban farming on physical and mental health? Does urban farming really contribute to social cohesion and feelings of connectedness? And what are the outcomes on shifts to a more sustainable lifestyle because of practicing urban farming? The second one was to understand, if urban farming really contributed to the regulation of ambient temperature. And this is what we heard from a lot of sort of interviews and surveys, that it did contribute. So we wanted to dig a little bit deeper. The third aspect was around material well-being, to understand, what are the different models and practices that that were happening in urban farming that contributed to improving material well-being. And does really the current landscape of policies support that kind of scaling up of urban farming for sort of material well-being outcomes? So going to the first case study, the question we were asking is, does urban agriculture make us healthier and happier? So this was a question that we asked, and the results definitely showed us that there were physical health, mental health, positive physical and mental health outcomes from urban agriculture, but also the sense of connectedness, pro-environment values were also sort of showing up as important outcomes of practicing urban agriculture. So I'm just going to move very quickly over this. Okay, so the second question that we were asking was, does home gardens regulate ambient temperature? And in order to understand this, we chose multiple methods to do this. So first, we did a rapid literature review focusing on heat mitigation and the connection between heat mitigation and urban agriculture. And then also collected primary data using perception-based and observational data to understand what was the perception around urban gardening and its heat mitigation capacity. So from the perception survey, which we framed around, what is the housing and gardening structure, what are the perceptions of temperature regulation benefits, also what is the kind of cooling devices that are being used in different homes, we found that at least 45% of the respondents agreed that there is definitely, at least in terms of perception, there is a decrease in temperature they felt when they had, either rooftop gardens or gardens around their homes. And 35% strongly agreed. So basically, almost 70% of the population, of the respondents, agreed that there was some positive impact because of urban farming. And then based on this perception survey, we also did another study, which was actually a simulation study, where we chose a few households to actually put in some sensors to actually test whether there was any sort of difference in temperature because of urban gardening. And here the objective was to really kind of understand what kind of temperature relief was provided by rooftop gardens. Did it at the neighborhood scale do anything to urban heat island? Did it reduce the urban heat island effect because of urban gardens? And was there a cost reduction on air conditioning and cooling because of because of rooftop gardening, especially? The next case study was around material well-being aspects, and this was to really understand if urban and peri-urban agriculture is has the potential to become a source of livelihood for large numbers of people. At least what we see in this case study is that basically at a household level, urban farming and urban agriculture does not really have major material well-being implications for practitioners. So basically, at a household level, there were very few respondents who said they were able to grow enough to supply for their enough to cover their entire need for the household, and very few who said that beyond their own need they were able to sell and make money out of it. Even in low-income settlements, the fact that urban agriculture was really not helping them sort of even break even to the amount of costs they were incurring because of urban agriculture. But when you have enough capital to raise it into enterprise, then we see that there is a lot of potential for urban agriculture to be practiced in a financially gainful way. So, and right now in Indian cities, there is a very vibrant culture of especially urban consumers demanding fresh, organic, safe food, which is making these urban agriculture practitioners and enterprises become more and more profitable. And some of the models that we see, for example, are there are some social enterprise models which talk about engaging urban poor and employing them in these urban farms, especially as malis, basically gardeners, and who are trained in setting up gardens in other homes. And so this is at least packaged as a social enterprise where especially migrant workers who have some sort of a background in farming are brought into this enterprise and skilled with soft skills on how to speak with urban customers, and then sort of employed here. And then there is another model which sort of engages peri-urban farmers, slightly larger scale farmers, where usually this model of farm to fork enterprises sort of operate. So they aggregate consumers, figure out what the demand from the consumer is, and then communicate it to the farmers, and then the farmers grow what the consumers need. So there is almost like a it's a full cycle where the consumers are wanting to consumers say what they want, and the farmers will then grow and make sure that they also have a steady customer base. And then the third model is around engaging skilled and educated youth in high-tech farming, much of aquaponics and hydroponics, where exotics are grown, and they have a very niche clientele where that there is a niche customer base and your products will definitely get consumed. So there are large farms that are using technology, high-end technology, to sort of grow, and this is also empowering and inspiring a new generation of skilled farmers, younger people getting into farming with a certain level of education and good returns on what they are investing in. Okay, I'll just move through this. And in addition to that, we had some other modeling tasks that we undertook. So one of the first tasks was to understand whether what are the impacts of UPA in Chennai and Bangalore on carbon stock and NDVI up till 2040. And what we found was that rooftop gardens will have negligible impacts on especially carbon stock and NDVI, and especially rooftop gardens. But maybe urban agriculture and forestry may have greater impact. So this whole thing about rooftop garden will improve carbon stock is not really something that that showed us positive impact in our modeling assessment. The second one we took up was around comparison of life cycle carbon emissions of UPA versus traditional farming traditional farm supply chains. So what we wanted to find out was, especially if we do shorter food miles, how does that contribute to the supply chains, the carbon emission life cycle carbon emissions of supply chains? So what we found was that UPA supply chains emit significantly lower carbon dioxide as compared to traditional farm supply chains, obviously because of the shorter supply chains involved in it. But rooftop farms could emit extraordinarily high levels of carbon dioxide per ton of produce because of the kind of inputs that were involved in cultivating on rooftops. So unless we switch to renewable energy sources, especially for irrigation, rooftop farms were not really making the cut in terms of reducing carbon dioxide emission per ton of produce. So finally, this project also sort of managed to get some very interesting outputs other than journal articles, and one of them was this compendium of case studies, which called Sowing Sustainable Cities, for which we actually brought in practitioners from different sort of thematics, including environment and sustainability, food, nutrition and livelihood, gender and subjective well-being, from the policy and planning perspective, to write cases on how they have practiced urban farming in their own fields and what kind of outcomes it has led to. So this was a good sort of output in terms of working with practitioners and stakeholders to come up with a compendium. The other one that we were able to bring out through this project was an online exhibition called Growing Greener Cities, which actually captured narratives again from practitioners, and this is something that's open to all, still sort of ongoing, and captures narratives around greener cities, healthier and happier citizens, nutritional outcomes, gendered role of urban agriculture, labor and income in space. And because this project happened in Tanzania and India, it captures narratives from both these countries. And finally, we were also able to engage with a lot of government and policy stakeholders. And based on all our interactions, we came up with an action agenda, especially for government officials, on how to think about mainstreaming urban agriculture in cities. So we looked into aspects of creating green jobs, or how do you close the loop between composting, food growing, and waste segregation. How do you introduce urban agriculture in schools and in environmental education? And finally, in the planning of cities. So this is an this project concluded in 2022, but we're taking this forward in terms of other projects to sort of understand other implications and other outcomes of urban agriculture, including for biodiversity at the city scale. Yeah, this was also based on our key informant interviews and our surveys. This was a mapping on how urban agriculture sort of supports different SDGs, and how many respondents sort of corresponded to saying that, you know, SDG 1, SDG 2, or SDG 5 or 10 were sort of in one way or the other met by urban agriculture. So I'll stop here. This just wanted to acknowledge that this project was funded by the British Academy, and we did this project in collaboration with the University of East Anglia, Azim Premji University, and IIT Madras in India, along with ourselves. I'll just stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Many thanks for another very informative presentation. So we have, at least we're allotted half an hour more. So I'd like to encourage not only questions or comments to the presentation that just concluded, but in general, as we again, to remind ourselves of our goals of building collaborations around research and teaching comments. But let me allow myself to make a comment that I was very pleased with how you started your presentation, in that you reminded the audience that cities represent an opportunity. I say that because for many years, often when the community of scientists and activists who are interested in climate change engage with cities, cities were often addressed as, well, too bad they exist, because they are a long collection of problems. But they exist. What can we do about it? Let's think what we can do. Ignoring the fact that, you know, this is something that we know, we studied for a long time. Cities are a main driver of socioeconomic development, not just a consequence, but a driver. So that our challenge is to think of how can these processes and individual level decisions, and as you said, Regina, what leads individuals to move to cities? How can those processes and decision-making processes be woven into adaptation practices is our challenge. And here I want to call attention people to a report, I put it in the chat, that was released right before the recently concluded SDG Summit at the United Nations. It was a United Nations report on synergies between achieving the SDGs and adaptation to climate change. And this report actually calls attention that the biggest synergy is urbanization. So I think that's, so I was very happy to see that a presentation that starts out not just by reminding the audience, these are all the reasons why we should not be living in cities, but what do you know, we do, but rather there are reasons why the poor keep moving to cities. So
absolutely.
Thank you. And I think that's important too. So again, why don't we open up for questions to the presentation?
Jose, I just want to make a comment that it's a wonderful talk. Again, I think our Indian colleagues have all the elements covered, from hydrology, eco-hydrology to climate change science, and to landscape planning, landscape architecture. I think, to me, these are all very relevant, important studies. To me, I'm very excited to hear landscapes again. I think the global scientific community has missed out a very important, what we call landscape ecologists call pivotal scale domain, that is regional landscape. And also I will see that although the individual studies are outstanding, I think we need a comprehensive framework to stitch all the things together. I use Jagdish term, stitch like that, integrate all these things together. To me, that framework is called Landscape Sustainability Research Framework, in which I think landscape planning, landscape governance are so essential. That's why I think this talk is really great. I hope we can work together and promote the science of landscape sustainability, which I think really provides a solution. Speaking of urban agriculture, we have a paper, several colleagues of mine in different universities had a paper, it's going to appear in Nature Food. I think for urban agriculture, clearly this is part of the sustainability solution at landscape and also global scale. But I think the biggest challenge today for us is to scale up urban agriculture practices, right? From rooftop to backyard, foreyard, and really produce solutions that make a difference. I hope we're going to have more discussion on that, how to scale up urban agriculture.
Yeah, if I
Thank you so much.
I just like to say that yes, in India, actually, practicing growing at home is not a new thing at all. From time immemorial, at least there are a few herbs in every Indian household, that people grow. And of course, there's a larger uptake of urban agriculture in cities now. There's a lot more recognition of, safe food, nutritious food. in the context of food available in the market being quite contaminated. But the challenge is really scaling. So while we have a lot of individual examples and smaller informal examples, I think the challenge really is that we've not been able to scale in a formal way. So there are no policy interventions, there is no policy recognition of urban agriculture despite its multiple benefits across various sectors, including health, education, planning, climate. So despite its multiple benefits across many sectors, we don't see any policy that sort of mainstreams urban agriculture. And that's one of the study we did where we identify entry points in different sectors where you could mainstream urban agriculture in those sectors and still reap the benefits across SDGs, across climate mitigation, across adaptation. So almost in a very climate resilient development sort of a way of thinking.
Yeah.
Sorry, let me just check because I might have made. Is there another presentation slated, or have we indeed come to the end of the presentation?
No, we have Amir Bazaz next.
Oh, sorry. So why don't we have the presentation, because we were slated until 9:30. I think we can stay a few minutes more. But my apologies. So, Amir.
No, it's fine. It's perfectly fine. I think discussions are more important, and I don't have many slides, and I just wanted to talk about something that I have been engaged with very closely over the last 3 years, and some ideas around sustainability education and the experiments that I have been doing. I think it'll be a nice dovetailing of all these scientific things, and it'll also be not so intense, but quite, I believe, quite useful for every one of us. But a little bit about me. I am a trained engineer and worked in engineering firms for many years before I decided to get out of frustration and joined a PhD program. The PhD program that I joined was in a business school, and all the paradoxes you will hear from my life history. And that business school is quite a renowned school in India, and a bunch of people from various conventional business departments came together and started a department or a group there at the business school. It's called the Public Systems Group, and the idea was to first list down important policy questions and then try and answer those policy questions. But at the foundations of all of it was functioning of a market. So market ideology and market philosophy to be leveraged to solve policy challenges. So I enrolled myself in that PhD program, and I did quant work. I worked on a bottom-up energy systems model, and I worked on questions of climate, on energy. It was a partial equilibrium model, and that was the last time I did quantitative assessment. I finished my PhD. I did what I had to, and then I did something which really is the core question that I have been exploring many years, and for good or for worst, my engagement with the business school was partly responsible for that, and that department there, which still exists. I cultivated a lot of interest at the interface of science and policy. And science, I'm like loosely defining here, something that happens in the academic realm and then gets translated into the policy world. And that science policy interface is something that has kept me interested for a very long time. And I work closely with all my colleagues here on many interesting questions. But how do we excite policy and how do we think about policy, and what kind of policy questions are important questions to answer. That has been my prime focus over many years of my work in the post-PhD space. And that's a little bit about me. And what I'll be talking about, and I'm just laying out the context, is there have been some work which has started to happen over the last 3.5 years. Uh, and it was partly serendipitous because I got somehow involved in a project that was looking at education system as a lever to transform, to think about sustainable futures. And it was an Africa India program. It's just wrapping up. And the question that we were trying to answer in that project was that how can educate, what needs to transform in the education system so that we are able to think about sustainable livelihoods, we are able to think about climate action, and we are able to think about sustainable cities. And it was a very interesting project which actually helped me somehow, and it has ended up becoming quite a pursuit and quite interesting to get into how can we collectively, individually, collaboratively think about education, and more importantly, sustainability education. So I'll talk a little bit about that experience and the build-up from that experience because there's some interesting work that I have been engaged with. This kind of coincided with some shifts in particularly higher education in India, which are happening at the moment. I don't know where it will take us, but I think there's an education policy that at least has all the good or important words in it. It's about interdisciplinarity, it's about practice integration, etc., etc. But none of the systems, particularly the higher education system, none of these systems have, they don't understand it. They're struggling with translating it, making it tangible, relatable, and figuring this out. And something popped up around this time, which is what I'm engaged with, and I hope it will be of interest to all of you here. So let me share my screen. I guess it's visible, so I'll put it in the screen share. Just a minute. Okay. So this was this was the motivation, and the motivation was that, look, we have a goal for cities, and it's very narrowly defined, but actually a city is a space that integrates almost all the SDGs. So what is an education-centric response to this? And the idea that we toyed with was that how do we localize or hyper-localize all the multiple goals that we have on our plates? Is there an educational or a learning template to realize this? And that became the starting point to think about transforming education systems. And to illustrate this, like the question was that, okay, suppose we want to understand and teach urban mobility from a sustainability point of view. So how do we teach this? We talk about infrastructure and service. We talk about key conceptual categories. Who should we teach with? Who are our partners here? For example, we cannot teach in big cities about urban mobility without bringing in a private service provider. And then how do we use this as a conceptual trope to talk about co-development issues like jobs, like education, like energy, etc. And then we started thinking systematically about it and thought, okay, let's templatize it. So what are the three big essential elements plus sustainable livelihoods? So we need to have an education response to sustainable development. We have to have a response to sustainable cities and communities and for climate action. So we definitely need to address poverty, gender, inequality, but we, at the same time, we have to think about an education response, which is just not about knowledge, but the capacity. It's also about capacities at multiple levels, but most importantly, to understand that how do we think about building agency, and how do we empower actors in the urban space. And when we think about climate action, and Chandni talked about this, that it's an era of transition, but transition leading to transformation. So, but we need to think from systems. So, but there is no education system or an higher education response that thinks like this, because it's siloed, it's focused on disciplines, etc., etc. So this was a template that we started with, and these were the questions that we came up with. Okay, we have to develop a professional education program that addresses or thinks about conservation and justice and all those things that Jagdish talked about, Chandni talked about, etc., but also about social justice. And then we have the disciplinary rigidity, but how can each of these disciplines, even if we kind of internalize that they exist and we can't toy much about with that, how can we enter from these disciplinary knowledges and think about problematizing the challenges that we see, and think about learning through the process of engagement, and how all of this ties up or adds up or connects with non-formal education that's all around us. And the other big challenge is to make it relatable, to make it accessible, to make it political and policy centric. How do we bring policy integration? And then we kind of hit with limits to action, because there is a spatial context and there is a temporal context. There is a proximate challenge and there is a challenge that's not visible anymore. For example, poverty is a proximate challenge, but mitigation is something that happens over a period of time. So how do we bring all of this? Then we started, and this is coming from that Transforming Education for Sustainable Futures project. So I'm giving some examples. We started investigating what's happening in the country. So I picked 3 examples. And we did some action research. We kind of responded to the educational or learning crisis. So first we looked at architecture education in India. It's like very city centric, and the starting data there, which hit us very hard, was that look, we are building with just 5% of the people in the cities. 95% are out of professional services. So what are we building? It's just not catering to the idea of justice. And when we started looking at and unpacking systematically what is wrong with architecture education, we realized that just doesn't have the soul. We are just not integrating ideas of justice, the ideas of cultural sustainability, the ideas of spatial culture into the curriculum frame. And essentially, we are just churning out instrumentalists who just know how to work with certain tools. Then we kind of looked at an alternate education, which is outside of formal education, a youth fellowship program in Mumbai, which which attempts to make research accessible to marginalized youth and equips them with the agency to respond to the challenges of the city. So the city becomes a learning lab. You organize yourself into a group. You go through this 52-week journey. You diagnose the problem. You understand how that problem can be solved. It is relatable. It is tangible. It is right there, which is happening. And then you have interdisciplinary exploring interdisciplinary spaces. So you kind of think about education as a public education project. So public engagement and the idea of making education widely accessible, democratic, and also engaging. Because you consider education as a public education project. So these were some of the things that we worked on for many years. And of course, I'll share the link to the website. We have a lot of documentation around this. But I just wanted to do this build up to talk about something interesting that is happening over the last 1 year. So a private car company comes to me and says that, look, I hire a lot of young people from engineering colleges, like tech education from many of these colleges in the country, and they just don't know what sustainability is. So I asked them, why do you want people to know about sustainability? So they come back and tell me, like, look, we are in the business of making cars. Urban landscapes have to be sustainable, otherwise who'll buy our cars? We need to kind of innovate. We need to think about big ideas, but sustainability has to be at the center of that pursuit. So I said, I don't know how can we do this? This is a different terrain. So what we did was that we did a series of workshops with faculty and students across 5 colleges. There were 10 sessions, about 40 hours of engagement. And we just asked them about what do they understand about sustainability, and can they, how are they integrating sustainability into what they are doing? And can they think about using this as a lever to do something about the city, to solve some problems that they are facing? And I found that, of course, there were some survey results, and these were some observations, like there's just no imagination of what sustainability means. A lot of them said that it's just about saving water. Some of them said that it's about carbon, but the whole idea of social and economic sustainability was just not hitting them. Of course, you can't expect an engineering faculty or an engineering student to know deeply about it, but at least some sense of these dimensions are important, because it's where you have your practice. You work in cities. You kind of engage with economic activities in the cities. The second issue that I saw was that there's no agency-oriented education. So it's just like transferring equations from textbooks to individual minds. So you are instrumentalizing education, but you're not thinking about education as empowerment, education as freedom, education as agency. And then, of course, you have very limited imagination about pedagogy. So you just don't know how to use the landscape of the city. Just like I was talking about city as a learning lab, you just don't know. You're structurally limited, constrained. You don't have the tools. You don't have the mechanisms in place, and therefore your learning is very, very narrow. So I'll end here, but there's something happening, and it'll be nice to keep engaging. So over the next 18 months, I've secured some grant to work with a few engineering colleges, a few engineering disciplines, and try and think about mainstreaming or integrating sustainability into at least I'm not disturbing the structure. I'm trying to tinker with content and I'm trying to experiment with learning templates. I'm trying to experiment with pedagogy to somehow think about at least seeding this idea amongst the tech community. And I think that it's a very prominent community in India, and let's see what happens. And I'll end with an anecdote that I was doing this a training in one of the engineering colleges, and two young faculty came up to me and said, like, look, we are doing something like this. Can you tell us that we are on the right path? So I asked them that what are they doing? So they said that, look, we are civil engineering faculty, and we were really worried about that we are not integrating enough, and we are not creating an education-centric response to city problems. So I said, what did you do? What did you do? So they said that they sat together and kind of identified 4 or 5 master's theses and located that thesis in a context with in a challenge that they were facing uh, quite prominently. So there was a dump yard close to the engineering college, and they used that dump yard and wrapped around all the mechanics of civil engineering that, okay, this is an action project and you have to learn through solving this dump yard problem, and think about groundwater pollution, think about surface water pollution, think about hydrology, think about landscaping, think about X, Y, and Z, think about recycling, think about composting. And they curated this quite systematically. And they were bemoaning the fact that, look, we are trying to do this within civil engineering, but we're just not able to speak with electrical engineering people. We're not just not able to speak with computer science. So this is something that I've just begun to enable conversations across disciplines, to think about reforming or transforming higher education from a tech education perspective, and let's see where it goes. But I'm quite confident that of course through support from like-minded people like ASUs and Jose's, and of course my colleagues here, that something remarkable could be potentially created. It's an experiment, but I'm quite confident. Thank you very much. I'll stop here. Sorry, I took a lot of time.
No, thank you, Amir, and thank you very much. I'd like to make a brief remarks. I know we're pressing for time, but you probably know, but just to highlight, the questions you have just asked and the conversation you think needs to be going on is absolutely one that higher education institutions in the United States are also asking. Of course, very different setting in the United States, and it's been asked in many places worldwide. Yes, we all seem to agree. We need profound societal technological transformations. How are we going to train the individuals to actually do that? And the shortage of individuals with the right frame of mind, of course, putting aside the question of what is that right frame of mind, is now being highlighted in a number of reports, going from the United Nations to a report released just last week by the National Academy of Sciences in the United States. So again, for the interest of brevity, please contact me because I can put you in contact with organizations, departments here at ASU. We have recently started a School of Sustainable Engineering. So I can put you. But what I'd like to share with everybody, just again, going to be very brief, because we at ASU are about to undertake a very significant experiment, so to speak. All universities in the United States that teach undergraduates have the following thing. It's called a general plan of studies. So basically, it's a decision, it's a choice made by the university of what is it that any person who graduates as an undergraduate from MIT, from Harvard, from ASU, from the University of Michigan, from Duke, what do they need to know regardless of their major? So that's a very important decision, a very important choice. And then that's supposed to translate that, well, again, Amir, you might be an engineering undergraduate. Jingo, you're a mathematics undergraduate. Garima, you're economics. Jose, you're into medieval English poetry coming out from ASU. It doesn't matter. You all need to have taken courses that are mapped into that plan of studies, okay? The big deal, big deal. Therefore, they are not changed very often because, to have a general plan of studies presupposes a discussion, and it has to be approved by a variety of bodies. So they tend to exist for a long time. Arizona State University has a general plan of studies. It dates from the 1970s. Okay, so think of all the things. We are about to change it. We have been involved in a project began almost 5 years ago to change it and transform it. This general plan of study identifies knowledge areas that any ASU undergraduate upon graduation must have been exposed to, regardless of major. And one of those knowledge areas is global sustainability thinking. It will be the first university in the United States that states, that tells the world, it is our obligation to teach our undergraduates to think about global sustainability issues. Let's see how it's a big change. It's a big deal for us. Again, I'm not suggesting that our process and our views on global sustainability are directly relevant to the situation in India, but it might be of some relevance. So if there's an interest, I can share this material. And I happen to be, for purely, I think, accidental reasons, I'm part of the university body, not a General Studies Council, that has been kind of designing the plan of studies and now has to unleash it on the university. So I believe our discussions as to what is sustainability thinking might be of some relevance. So again, Amir or Jagdish, contact me and I can barrage you with documents regarding these discussions. And one last comment, just recently, a few weeks ago, there's a new national organization was founded in the United States, National Sustainability Association, and it brings together the various sustainability programs, because by now there are more than a handful, maybe not a lot, but more than a handful academic programs on sustainability in US academia. They have come together with the idea of sharing experiences, sharing curricula. How can we do better what we are all doing? So many discussions in which I can see the IIHS could serve as a conduit to bring these discussions happening in the US, in Europe, globally, to India, as you think about how will your educational system respond. So,
absolutely. I'll write to you separately, Jose, and Rimjim, you too. So I'll seek your guidance and advice as we move ahead on this. And this is one of the many fronts that we have opened around integration. So there's a track on disaster education also, but focused on infrastructure. So we have created something new and innovative. I'll share that with you. And that is in collaboration with University College London. So we are trying hard, and we'll need your support and also your guidance from your rich experience, because I feel that this is some kind of a systemic response to the crisis we are living in. And if it sustains, if it finds feet, then I think we owe it to the future. That's what I believe.
yes, yes, maybe one more thing. And increasingly, what we're also finding, again, in the United States, but I think this applies worldwide, is so we have a responsibility to teach students. That's why they come to us. But a lot of our students at ASU, but that's also, I think, worldwide, upon graduating, a small subset of them go on to graduate school, For the vast majority of our students, the first question on their minds the day after they graduate is, am I going to get a job?
Job.
I need to get a job. My family expects me to get a job. Okay, I need to get a job. And I need to be able to go to the labor market and says, what are you good at? And what we have come to word is that if you go to the labor market and says, well, you can hire me because I'm very good in sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
For most people in the United States, most employers, and so we need to take very seriously this responsibility. But on the other hand, what we need is to fuse all sorts of institutions and workplaces with people who care about sustainability. If sustainability remains only something that some academics worry at US universities, then there will be no sustainability transition in the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, there will not. So, but I think that's probably the case also in India. I suspect that a lot of university students in India, upon graduation, that's also the first question on their mind.
Absolutely.
Unless they already have lined up an academic job. Yeah. Am I going to get a job? What am I good at? So I will imagine that this conversation that's starting to happen is one that India has a lot to say, and it will be terribly important that Indian universities participate in this discussion. So,
absolutely. Jagdish, would you like to close?
Yeah, let me just see that I guess there are no more questions. So I'd like to thank all the folks from the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University, both the faculty and the students, and also all the folks from IIHS. Few younger researchers were also there, I believe. And I think this has been, both the seminars have been really eye-opening in terms of the diversity, the depth, the rigor of the work being done at the School of Sustainability at ASU, something that we're really enthralled by. And I hope that today some of the work that my colleagues and I have shared with all of you will lead to exchange of ideas and collaboration in terms of both synthesis of work, research, as well as new ways to teach sustainability. Because I think that we need to connect the dots. I think we still have some way to go before we can teach sustainability in a way that can reach out to diverse audiences. We still have to get our act together. So that's where I think research and practice need to really feed into each other. And maybe then a new language will emerge, which will possibly be a little bit more accessible to people in different disciplines. So, I think that's all I had to say. And I hope that all of you at ASU hopefully will get a good breakfast now or a coffee, because you have a long day ahead. And just as my Indian colleagues here are probably waiting for their dinner.
Yes, and the next time, now we get to relax, because the next panel is going to be Garima, Aurora, Raksha. Now is your responsibility to put up a panel as good as these two panels that have preceded you. So you have a very high bar now to meet. No doubt you will do it. So we'll see you all soon on the 16th, and thank you again. And please, Amir, email me and send you lots of stuff. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.